If you've been listening to the Eat More Carbs podcast, you know that Reilly and I are both in our running era. To make sure that we're properly fueled for training, we're using both carbohydrates and 2Before.
2Before is an all-natural pre-workout designed to enhance athletic performance through the benefits of New Zealand blackcurrant berries. Studies have shown these berries to increase vasodilation and prime the body to kickstart muscle recovery. These antioxidant-rich berries have a sweet and tangy flavor and will level up your performance and recovery. Use code Reilly for 20% off 20 packs and multi-serve packs online at 2before.com.
This is the Eat More Carbs podcast. Hello and welcome to the Eat More Carbs podcast. My name is Jenna Fisher and I'm here with my co-host Reilly Beatty. This is a two-part series in which Reilly and I will be talking with Dr. Aubrey Armento and Amanda McCarthy from the Sports Medicine Center at Children's Hospital in Colorado. We're going to be discussing REDS, or Relative Energy Deficiency in sport, which includes topics like eating disorders and disordered eating. If during this two-part series you start to recognize some of the signs and symptoms that we're talking about in athletes, as some you might be experiencing, we encourage you to reach out to your healthcare provider. As always, you can join the waitlist for Reilly and I's concierge one-on-one sports nutrition coaching if you have additional needs from a sports nutrition perspective. We hope you enjoy this series on REDS.
So now let's jump into some of the nutrition for this. I would love to hear your opinions because we tell our athletes all the time this, but I would love to hear what you have to say. How long is it going to take for somebody to get out of REDS? Or how long is it going to take for somebody to get their period back?
It's such a great question. I get that question all the time, and I don't have a great answer. It's very different depending on the athlete. It's very different on what the cause of the underfueling is. And so if it's strictly like a logistical underfueling, so they're exercising for 4 or 5 hours a day, and they're also going to school, and they also are in theater and all of the things that high school kids do, potentially we can plan and like change their fueling patterns and get them to an adequate fueling status maybe within a month, depending on how underfueled they are, because we're going to step their nutrition up over time, right? And then they have to maintain it. And so I think the hard part is if it's logistical, it's a little bit more straightforward. And it's like, yeah, if you are compliant and you do what I tell you to do, then we can probably resolve it within a month or two. And then you have to continue to do that over time. If it's something that's more disordered eating based and eating disorder diagnosis, there's the complexities of the mental health component with that. There's generally another provider working with us with that as well. And I would say those cases generally, just to get to adequacy of fueling, on average, maybe take 3 to 6 months just to get to adequate fueling, and maybe longer depending on the athlete. I'm thinking of one specific athlete that we share that we're still not there consistently, right? And it's been a long time. So it depends. If we go back to that answer, right? It really depends on the athlete. It depends on the situation. It depends on the cause. It depends on the family, how supportive the family is, how aggressive of an approach they want to take. Yeah, I would say that's generally what I see in my office, but I don't have a really good, like, straightforward answer.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to maintenance of adequate energy balance. So you have to maintain energy balance adequately in order for your body to reverse the negative adaptations that have been made in response to low energy availability. So what we know in the triad literature more specifically is that when somebody's maintaining adequate energy balance, we can see hormonal disturbances kind of normalize in anywhere between that 3 to 6 month period of time. But when it comes to restoring bone density or improvement in bone density, that can take years in a lot of cases. And again, is all about maintenance of energy status and maintenance of normal menstrual function in the female athlete. And so it's a long game. And I think that's a lot of where I find athletes having trouble really sticking to that treatment plan, because it's not an immediate gratification situation, right? I mean, in some cases, I feel like we do see athletes who are like, oh my God, I feel so much better from an energy perspective, and like I'm doing better in my sport. And, they'll see some of those positive reinforcers a little bit sooner. But when it comes to getting your period back, when it comes to improvements in bone density and some of these things that just take longer from a physiologic perspective to improve, you really got to stick to it for a long period of time. I think that's hard for a lot of athletes if they're not really seeing those results more quickly.
Especially the beginning of getting refueled. It sucks. Like, there is no other way to put it than it sucks. you feel like you're eating too much, you feel full, you feel gassy. It can be hard to poop because your GI tract is slowed down and it does not feel good. And everything in your body is saying, this is not right. I am eating too much food. And it takes a really strong level of trust in the patient, I feel like, or the client, to be able to trust the dietitian that they're doing the right thing for them. And it takes a lot of encouragement on our end to say, like, I promise you this is going to pass and this is going to normalize and you're going to feel hungry and you're going to want to eat more than this. But there's a lot of surrendering that goes in that beginning of that process. And it is hard for athletes to do at the beginning a lot of times.
Especially when you're not like really seeing a reward or you have like an exercise restriction as well. It can be just like so challenging.
Yep, totally.
Not in the business of overnight success.
No.
Unfortunately, if I had a pill, I tell athletes this all the time, if I had a pill that would fix this, I would give it to you for free. Like, I will make your life easier, but I do not. And so we're going to do this the hard way.
I think it is just so much harder than people realize. And especially with social media, and, you know, we're active on social media, so we like to say it's a good and a bad thing, but we've really simplified nutrition. And this stuff is just so much more complicated. I get DMs all the time that are like, how many calories should I eat to get my period back? And it's like, well, there's like so many other factors that go into this. And there's, you know, so many deeper questions that we need to be asking and we need to be talking about besides just a calorie amount.
Yeah,
Totally.
For sure. And I think when you add the layer of disordered eating or an eating disorder in the mix, I should take a step back and say, I think another really important point to make is that having an eating disorder or disordered eating and REDS, they don't have to go together. You can have REDS without having an eating disorder or disordered eating. And I think there's a lot of stigma around all of it, but I have had some patients who've been resistant to the idea of having REDS because they're like, well, I don't have an eating disorder, right? Or I don't have a disordered relationship with food. And I think a lot of times that comes out over time as you start to challenge an athlete with food and they start to have a lot of distress around the changes that you're recommending, right? And that's when we kind of dive into more of the psychological aspect of things. But I think when you do have those disordered eating behaviors or an eating disorder, that in and of itself just makes refueling even more challenging. Like, everyone often deals with some of those physical consequences, like Amanda was alluding to, that are uncomfortable at the beginning. But if you're somebody who is just underfueled because of a lack of education or recognition of your nutrition needs, and you're very willing to nutritionally restore and don't really have some of those more psychological challenges around making those changes, we'll often see people get to that positive energy or adequate energy balance sooner, and they're able to maintain it more consistently than if we are working with an athlete who has disordered eating or an eating disorder. The road to get to that energy restored place is typically longer and windier and twistier and harder to stay on the road once you actually get to that point. And so that, I think, affects that journey a lot.
I'm sure it depends from athlete to athlete, but there sounds like there's a lot of challenges for individuals to overcome. So where do you start?
That's such a big question, Jenna. Where do you start? I ask a lot of questions. By the time they get to me, usually they've seen Dr. Armento or one of our sports med physicians. And so I have a general idea of what the picture is that they've gotten. And so my role is really just to dig deeper and like see what is the actual picture of what's going on and try to give them more details and then figure out what are the barriers that are getting in the way of us adequately fueling. Is it logistics? Is it an education component? Is it availability of food? Is it an eating disorder? So like what's going on here? I find that each patient I see, I approach in a different way, just depending on, again, the family dynamic and the patient. And I feel like my role is maybe a little bit more complex than others, just because I am often educating both the family or the parent or the caregiver as well as the teen. And sometimes their nutrition views are all the same and sometimes they are not. And so I feel like that adds another layer of complexity. So I'm really just trying to figure out, like, where does everyone stand and what are your beliefs and what do you think that this should look like and how do you think you're doing right now? And let me show you what you're doing here and what I anticipate your needs to be. And then how do you feel about that? And then how can we start to build towards this more adequate fueling plan to address these concerns that we have about your underfueling and REDS? That's my approach.
Yeah. And I think for me, I start often with whatever sort of medical workup is indicated, what labs and imaging and that sort of thing are indicated based on each athlete's presentation. nutrition. And then I also am a very big proponent of this team approach to the athletes. So Amanda and I are very lucky in that we work super closely together. We share clinic space once a week. We see athletes often back to back in our clinics together. So we can have a conversation about, this is what I'm seeing or worried about. This is what I'm seeing or worried about. Okay, let's make a cohesive plan together. And then also bringing in that mental health resource where indicated. So we work with a lot of community therapists, coordinating meetings amongst all the team members, making sure everybody is on the same page as far as the treatment plan goes, and communication of that to athletes and families if they're a younger athlete. And so I think a lot of the initial steps are also sort of assembling the team and setting up these modes of communication so that we can have that sort of streamlined, comprehensive care.
So just like RED-S can present so differently between athletes, the treatment for each athlete is also super individualized.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I think so.
Amanda, what would you say to an athlete, or I guess what are your recommendations for an athlete who maybe is meeting with a sports dietitian, has already gone to sports medicine, and is looking for ways to increase their energy availability? What are like 3 maybe tips that you have from a nutritional perspective?
Yeah, so number one, making sure they're eating consistently throughout the day, which a lot of our teen athletes are not doing. So are you eating at minimum 3 meals? Are you eating 1 to 3 snacks, depending on where your season is at? Making sure that we're getting consistent meals in. So for most of my young athletes, that ends up being they need to eat every 2 to 3-ish hours to meet their energy needs, especially while they're in season. So I would say consistency of fueling, number one. Number two, I use the athlete's plate, the USOPC visual a lot. And so showing them like what that athlete's plate looks like. And do you have half a plate of your grain and your carbohydrate foods? Do you have a full plate of food? Are you getting fat with your meal? Or does your plate look like a big salad with some chicken on it, which, you know, sounds delicious, but is by no means an adequate meal for a highly active teenager. So making sure we're getting all food groups. So I like to focus on 4 items at the meal: protein, grain, fat, and color. So if we can get those 4 things in, and color, quite frankly, is optional, because if you're going out to eat and you don't have it, then you can get an adequate meal with protein, grain, and fat. So that would be tip number 2. Tip number 3, I would say, is fueling around workouts. And again, we see this a lot as well, where kids will go to school all day. They might eat lunch. They may just have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for lunch, and then they don't eat anything, and then they go to practice, and then they come home and have dinner, and they may backload okay, but they're going, 6 to 7 hours without food during the middle of the day. So again, that's kind of the consistency piece, but making sure that they're getting something both before and after practice. And if they don't feel super hungry after practice, that's one of my non-negotiables, is like, I don't really care if you don't feel hungry after practice. Like, I need you to get some type of nutrition into your body. And so if that means you'll drink a glass of chocolate milk or a Gatorade or something, we have to get something into your body after practice so that we can start the refueling process. And quite frankly, when we do get those liquids into their body, usually they're just hot and their stomach shut down from their activity, right? So once we get them hydrated and cooled off, then their appetite returns pretty quickly. So yeah, I would say those would be my top 3 to get athletes adequately fueled.
As far as like steps from education for athletes, coaches, parents, other healthcare providers, what needs to be done in order to expand the awareness about RED-S in this population?
I think we're talking a lot more about it. So I'm a big runner. I follow running and really into that running world. And Amanda and I actually have a running athlete clinic that we do together. And I would say I've been very happy to see from the professional athletes in running in particular, a lot more talk around RED-S and athletes sharing their experiences with RED-S and with eating disorders and disordered eating. And I think there's a lot of value in those professional athletes, especially those that have really strong social media followings, to use their platform to increase awareness of RED-S. And I think overall there's been a movement towards optimizing like female athlete health and shining a light more on the female athlete in general. So I think that's a great step to take. And then I think more kind of on the ground level, like Amanda and I do a lot of combined educational talks to cross country and track teams because of our running athlete clinic. But, that's a great way. I mean, we recently had a school, I think there were like 70 to 80, it was a large school, 70 to 80 cross country track athletes that came to listen to us, and they'll often bring parents and coaches as well. So for us, just kind of in our local area, trying to get out to schools and spreading awareness about REDS. And then Amanda's amazing in providing these like practical nutrition strategies that I think are easily digestible and can be taken home and implemented with our young athletes. I think as people all over the country and the world in general start to do that type of educational outreach, I do think we'll continue to sort of see this shift over time where it's no longer normal to lose your period if you're training at a high level. You know, Amanda and I will do more like healthcare professional education on REDS and things to look out for and how to refer and that sort of thing to optimize the care and access to care for athletes too.
Yeah, I was going to mention that piece. I think within the University of Colorado, we have a fellowship and a residency program. And within sports medicine, we do a nutrition-based lecture, like what is helpful for the team physician to know for sports nutrition specifically. And I think that's helpful, but quite frankly, like that reaches like this many people, right? So sports dietitians are great at doing the education. And I see sports dietitians all over the country, like you guys who are out there and like doing the thing and fighting misinformation and like continue to do that. And I think that's necessary. But I think if on more of a systemic level, we could get more of this education put in for healthcare providers, not that they don't already have a very big program to go through, but if we could just like give some nuggets that are not just weight-based and more like fueling based for those providers, I think that makes it easier for them to see it and then to refer to a professional that can then help that person.
A lot of these things that we've kind of talked about might scare some athletes as far as like the long-term implications, what that means for their athletic career, what that means for their overall health. Are there ways, and what would those ways be from a preventative side of things? Like what do you recommend to like prevent REDS onset for an athlete that just like maybe wants to make sure that they're avoiding any type of a diagnosis in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think a general blanket recommendation is the idea of resisting diets or diet trends, right? I feel like there are so many out there and we're sort of battling all of the misinformation and everything that's read on social media, especially in that young athlete population. And so like Amanda says, you have a line, Amanda, I can't remember what it is.
I have a lot of one-liners. You're going to have to be more specific.
Yeah, Amanda has a great one-liner about how like the best diet for a young athlete is like no specific diet at all. Like let's just not even jump into like using necessarily the term diet, but more so, you know, looking at food in a positive way to enhance sports performance. So I think just trying to sort of combat societal pressures of falling into these diet traps is sort of easier rule of thumb to apply to hopefully keep people from falling into that. Because I've seen so many athletes who just sort of innocently are like, I want to try Whole30 because, you know, my friend is doing Whole30 or whatever. And then they end up in my office a year later, like with a clinical eating disorder, right? And obviously there's tons of factors that go into the development of an eating disorder, but it's not uncommon for us to hear this history of like, well, it all started when I decided I wanted to do XYZ diet. And so I think pushing back against that is one thing I would say.
I do tell athletes often because I feel like there's this constant search for the healthiest diet that they can have as an athlete, right? I just want to be healthy. I want to make sure I'm eating healthy things. And when they come into my office and they're so significantly underfueled, but they're eating a boatload of fruits and vegetables and they eat proteins and they eat some grains, you're like, oh, you're choosing all of these great whole foods, but you're eating 1,200 calories a day and you need 3,000 calories a day. So like they are shocked and usually quite upset when I say like, you're malnourished. You're choosing these great foods, but you have bad nutrition because you're not eating enough. And so it is actually more worthwhile for them to add in a scone, a bag of chips, you know, a slice of pizza, something that's high in calories to get their energy availability up while they have all of these other great food groups that are already available. That is going to help them recover so much faster and be healthier for them. But there's such a stigma on adding in processed foods or, you know, all of the other things that we see on the internet. So to Aubrey's point, I think if people can stay away from the trends that are in your face 100% of the time, all of the time, that's always the best strategy. But then my very biased statement is if an athlete's worried about it, go see a sports dietitian. We know what you need as an athlete. We know what you need as a human without being an athlete. We can kind of take all of those factors into play. We can talk through kind of what what you're thinking and what you're wanting to do and talking through if that's the best decision for you. I would say largely our people don't judge. We just really like food, and that's why we got into this field. There's obviously exceptions to that, but I think generally, like, we want people to feel well and to fuel their bodies well and to love what they're eating. And so that's really what our main goal is as dietitians.
Yeah, I think just moving away from this very common practice of demonizing food and categorizing food as good food or bad food or healthy food or unhealthy food, and just like, it's food. Let's just call it food. And then how can we use food to the best of our ability to optimize health and performance as an athlete? One of the sports psychologists that we work with, instead of calling foods good or bad, she calls them either party foods or power foods to her kids when she was like doing some like food education with her young children, and kind of how to message food in a way that doesn't demonize it. I love that. I'm like, power and party, they're both good, but like they serve different purposes at different times. I think also I really support this idea of moving away from like demonizing food or calling things good or bad, healthy, unhealthy, because I think that's sort of where all of this dieting starts, is like the avoidance of certain types of food or making certain foods bad, and then associating guilt or shame with eating those types of foods.
I want to echo that, because one of the biggest shocks I think for the athletes when they come like work with a sports dietitian is the foods that we're often recommending are not foods that you would think a dietitian would recommend. I always joke, I'm like, did you think that you were going to come see me and I was going to tell you to eat goldfish? Like, probably not. But I'm recommending that to everybody because, again, like, everything has its purpose. And a lot of the time athletes are not fueling properly because they're not eating some of these energy rich foods.
And it's impossible to meet your energy needs without them. It is absolutely impossible.
Yes. People come in and are like, I'm eating all this food. And I'm like, are you?
Our red flag, we joke about this a lot in our clinic, is when a parent comes in, they're like, they eat really healthy. And we're like, that's probably a red flag if we're thinking that we're eating really healthy, because oftentimes that means I'm eating a lot of whole foods or a lot of vegetables or a lot of fruits, which, yes, very nutrient dense foods, not very energy dense foods. And we need both of those things.
And I think it's hard because, kind of going back to what we talked about earlier, not all of this stuff is intentional. A lot of the times, like, athletes want the healthiest diet so that they can perform the best. And unfortunately, there's just so much miseducation out there when it comes to fueling as an athlete that they end up, falling into underfueling or reds. So we ask these 4 questions to everybody who comes onto the podcast. And the first question is, because this is the Eat More Carbs podcast, we have to know what your favorite carbohydrate is.
I would say it changes, but currently my favorite carbohydrate is white rice. I've been eating a lot of rice lately, but I'm also a big pasta fan. So
I have to say, these were the hardest questions for me. I was like, oh man, what is my favorite carb? I love carbs. I settled on bread and basically anything made with flour, because if I'm hungry and I can't find anything in the house, I will always go for a slice of bread and butter. And maybe that's from my childhood, but like, man, a good slice of bread is totally my jam.
Oh, do you like make your own bread, or do you have a specific brand?
I have made my own bread, which I love, but I also have 2 young children, and so that is not happening right now. I really love the Bavarian Bakery brand. I don't know if you've heard of that. I don't know. I'm like advertising for them. They can pay me for this if they come on here. But they have a delicious bread. I love sourdough of all like shapes and sizes. So I love sourdough bread. But yeah, I'm brioche, like bagels, like I'm really not picky. I will, if it's got flour in it, I'm gonna eat it and really like it.
I think bread or bagels are as leading as our favorite carbohydrate. I would have to go back and tally it up.
Nice.
Have you ever tried to make your own sourdough, or do you stick with other kinds of bread when you're making it?
No, I am a failure. I had a friend who gave me some sourdough starter, and I had really good intentions, and then I never did it. It was too intimidating for me. Have you done it?
I've never done it because I've heard that it's like a full-time job, and
It
I don't
is.
know if I'm ready for that commitment. So I'm just going to continue to buy it from the store and be okay with that.
Yeah, totally.
same.
Our next question is, what is your favorite pre-workout fuel?
I am a toast and peanut butter kind of gal. I also like toaster waffles and peanut butter as well, kind of depends. But lately, speaking of sourdough, I've been on a big sourdough bread kick. Toast and peanut butter is my usual go-to.
I am usually not the most organized before my workouts at this point in my life, thus the little people living in my home. And so usually I have like bananas that are available, or like dates I love because I can grab a handful of those and those feel great. Or like some type of like granola oatmeal based bar I love those too.
What about after your workout? What's your favorite post-workout fuel?
Oh, I would say oftentimes the way I time my workouts, I'm having a meal right after. But if I'm not having a meal, I like yogurt with berries and granola. And then I've also been doing lately a glass of orange juice and 2 hard-boiled eggs. I'm not sure where that came from. I just started to do it because my husband's been making lots of hard-boiled eggs, so they're like easy to grab. I'm like, got my carbs, got my protein, check. So that's what I have been doing lately.
Yeah, if I'm doing a snack, chocolate milk is like the most refreshing thing after a workout. So I've gotten back into that. It's been a while, but I've gotten back into that. But if I'm having a meal, same with Aubrey, like there's nothing better than like rice with soy sauce and fish. So like sushi rolls are my jam after a workout if I can get it. I love that.
Chocolate milk is definitely winning for the post-workout fuel question. There's no doubt.
So good.
It's chocolate milk and a meal. That seems to be our top 2. All right, now this always seems to be the hardest question. So we're big shoe people here. What is your favorite pair of kicks?
Okay, if I'm doing a running shoe, I would say my favorite pair. I have a pair of the On Running carbon plated shoes that I've run my last couple marathons in and love them. But if we're talking non-running shoes, I love my Birkenstock sandals. I basically live in them, so that's probably my other I mean, I don't wear Birkenstock sandals to work, but when I am not at work otherwise, I am wearing them.
I would support you in that. I'm happy to support, like, we'll figure that out.
I'm not sure if that's like deemed professional or like business professional wear to show up to clinic in my Birkenstock sandals.
You have to put a toe on them, I think, which might be interesting. I have a pair of the Brooks Special Edition, like USA sneakers. I think they're the Brooks launch brand. So one shoe is white, one shoe is blue. The soles are red on both of them. They're very loud. They have stars all over them. And I freaking love those things. Like maybe I'll wear those to clinic. That would be really fun.
Thank you both so much for being on this episode. I know that you've answered a ton of questions that our listeners have. We probably, like I said, have a billion more questions that we could have asked you. Unfortunately, not all of our listeners live in Colorado and have access to come and visit you, but are there ways that they could like find resources from y'all or follow you on social media? Anything that you're comfortable sharing?
So we have our sports medicine center through Children's Hospital Colorado has a web page. We do have some nutrition resources on there, and then there's sports medicine preventative resources for more targeted towards like the teen and collegiate athlete. That's probably the best way. I don't have social media channels.
That's probably what I would go to. I only have a personal Instagram. Amanda and I should probably up our social media game, but we haven't.
Thank you guys so much for being on the podcast today. We so appreciate you guys sharing all that you have shared.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Eat More Carbs podcast with Dr. Aubrey Armento and Amanda McCarthy. If you have questions for Reilly and I, you can find us on Instagram. You can find Reilly at easy.sports.nutrition, and you can find me at jenna.fisher.nutrition. Thank you again for listening. Please make sure you rate, subscribe, and review. And as always, remember to eat more carbs.